In 53 BC, inside the royal court of Armenia, a wedding banquet was underway. The entertainment for the evening was a performance of Euripides' tragedy, the Bacchae. In the play's climax, a frenzied woman enters holding the severed head of a mountain lion. But as the Greek actor Jason strode onto the stage to deliver his lines, the prop in his hand was heavy, cold, and dripping real blood. It was not a stage prop. It was the severed head of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who effectively owned half of Rome, now reduced to a grisly trophy for a foreign king. This was the wretched end of the wealthiest man in the Republic, who had marched east, promising to return with the treasures of the Orient, only to become a prop in a dinner theater. Welcome back to World Chronicles. This grim spectacle marked the definitive end of one of the most disastrous military campaigns in ancient history. The Battle of Carrhae was not merely a defeat. It was a brutal collision between the rigid discipline of the Roman legions and the fluid, lethal mastery of the Parthian cavalry. It was a catastrophe born not of strategic necessity, but of one man's desperate, blinding insecurity. Crassus marched 40,000 men into the Mesopotamian desert to prove he was the equal of Caesar and Pompey, but he found that in the dunes, gold could not buy survival, and political influence could not stop an arrow. To understand why a man of 60, already possessing a fortune that could buy kingdoms, would drag himself into the scorching deserts of Syria, one must look not at the map, but at the bruised ego of Marcus Licinius Crassus. Rome in 53 BC was ruled by the uneasy alliance known as the First Triumvirate, a three-headed monster of ambition. On one side stood Pompey the Great, the man who had redrawn the maps of the East and was hailed as a conqueror. On the other was Julius Caesar, who was at that very moment carving his name into history with the blood of the Gauls. And then there was Crassus. He was the financier, the landlord, the man who crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus decades prior. But in the ruthless currency of Roman politics, old victories bought no silence. Crassus sat at the table of power, but he felt like a guest. His colleagues were generals. He was merely rich. In the eyes of the Senate and the mob, gold commanded envy, but only military triumph commanded auctoritas, true authority. He was desperate to equalize the score. Parthia was not an imminent threat to the Republic's security. It was simply the only prize large enough to elevate Crassus to the level of Caesar and Pompey. It was a war of vanity, manufactured entirely by a man terrified of being forgotten. The invasion was so transparently unjust that it sickened even the war-hardened Roman populace. When Crassus prepared to depart the city, he was not met with cheering crowds, but with a lone, furious figure blocking his path. The tribune of the plebs, Aetius Capito, stood at the gates, lighting a brazier of incense. As Crassus passed, the tribune screamed ancient, terrible curses, invoking strange and obscure gods to witness the impiety of this war. Romans were superstitious, believing that such curses held power even over the one who spoke them. Crassus, blinded by the mirage of military glory, ignored the smoke and the screams, marching his legions out of Rome and straight into the waiting jaws of a fate he had sealed with his own insecurity. Crassus arrived in the east, and for a moment, sanity nearly prevailed. King Artavasdes II of Armenia, a longtime ally of Rome, rode into the Roman camp with a lifeline. He offered a massive reinforcement of nearly 50,000 troops, effectively doubling Crassus's fighting power. But there was a condition. The Romans had to march through the mountains of Armenia. In those rugged highlands, the steep slopes and narrow passes would nullify the mobility of the deadly Parthian cavalry, allowing the Roman legions to fight on their own terms. It was a sound, logical, and safe strategy. But Crassus, driven by impatience and the arrogance of a man who believed money could bypass logistics, rejected it. He did not want a slow, grinding campaign in the mountains. He wanted a straight line to the Parthian capital of Seleucia. He chose the desert to guide him through this unfamiliar hell. Crassus placed his trust in an Arab chieftain named Ariamnes. It was the final nail in the coffin. Ariamnes had once served Pompey and wore the mask of a Roman ally, but his loyalty had long since been bought by Parthian gold. With a tongue as sharp as a serpent, Ariamnes goaded Crassus, mocking the slow pace of the legions and asking if they intended to build a new city in the sand rather than conquer one. He urged them away from the life-giving waters of the Euphrates River, leading the army deeper into the vast, open wasteland of Mesopotamia. As the legions turned their backs on the river, the landscape began to change, turning hostile and alien. The fertile soil gave way to an endless ocean of sand and baked earth. There were no trees for shade, no streams for water, and no hills for cover. Only a flat, burning horizon that stretched endlessly in every direction. The environment itself became an enemy weapon. The heat hammered down on men wearing 40 pounds of iron armor, turning their protection into ovens. Thirst began to gnaw at discipline. The scouts reported nothing but wild gazelles and ostriches, yet an unseen presence watched them from the shimmering heat haze. By the time Ariamnes vanished into the night to report to his true masters, the trap had already snapped shut. The Roman army was adrift in a sea of sand, exposed, exhausted, and blind. As the Roman army trudged through the haze near the town of Carrhae, the enemy finally revealed themselves. To the untrained eye, the Parthian force seemed almost underwhelming. Crassus commanded a juggernaut of roughly 40,000 men, the vast majority of them heavy legionary infantry, the finest close-quarters fighting machine the world had ever seen. In a conventional battle, on a conventional field, they were unstoppable. Fearing an ambush from the sides, Crassus ordered his men into a massive, hollow square formation. It was a fortress of flesh and iron, 12 men deep, designed to repel charges from any direction. But this formation, impenetrable as it was, had a fatal flaw. It was static. It was a hammer waiting for a nail that would never present itself. Facing this wall of Roman steel was the Parthian general Surena, a tactical genius who understood that he could not win a contest of brute strength. He brought with him a force of only 10,000 horsemen, outnumbered 4 to 1. But the composition of this force was designed specifically to dismantle the Roman advantages. 9,000 of them were horse archers, light cavalry capable of striking from a distance and retreating faster than any legionary could march. The remaining 1,000 were cataphracts, ancient tanks. These were heavy cavalry, where both man and horse were completely encased in scale armor, capable of delivering a shattering impact should the Roman line waver. The true genius of Surena's plan, however, was not on the battlefield, but behind it. In ancient warfare, archers were limited by their quivers. Once they fired their 30 or 40 arrows, they were useless. Roman doctrine relied on this. Weather the storm, wait for the enemy to run dry, and then close the distance. Surena broke this rule. Hidden behind the lines, he had assembled a train of 1,000 camels, loaded not with water or food, but with crate after crate of spare arrows. He had turned his archers into an assembly line of death, with unlimited ammunition. The Romans were prepared for a battle of swords and shields, a test of will and stamina. Instead, they were walking into an industrial slaughter where the enemy could strike indefinitely without ever coming within reach of a gladius. The hollow square was not a defense. It was simply a larger target. The battle began with a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The deep, resonant thrum of thousands of compound bows releasing in unison. The air itself seemed to vibrate with death. The Roman legions, disciplined as ever, reacted instantly to the threat. They locked their scuda, their large, curved rectangular shields, together, forming the famous Testudo or tortoise formation. Against the light bows of Gallic or Germanic tribes, this wall of wood and leather was historically impenetrable. But the Parthian bow was a different beast entirely. Constructed of laminated wood, horn, and sinew, it generated a velocity that defied Roman experience. The arrows did not merely strike the shields. They hammered them with the force of a hammer blow. The heavy iron tips punched through the wood and leather, nailing the legionaries' hands to their own shields. Men screamed as arrows pierced their mail, pinning their feet to the scorching sand. The tortoise rapidly became a cage. Inside the tight formation, the heat was suffocating, the smell of sweat and blood mixing in the stagnant air. The soldiers were rendered impotent. To break formation was suicide. To stay was to be slowly whittled away. They stood their ground, waiting for the inevitable lull in the storm. Every Roman officer knew the logic of archery. A quiver holds only so many arrows. They believed they simply had to endure until the enemy was spent, and then the heavy infantry could advance. Crassus, watching from the center, clung to this same hope. He watched the Parthian horsemen ride up, loose their volleys, and wheel away. But as the hours dragged on under the relentless sun, the arrows did not stop. Then, Crassus saw the sight that broke his spirit. The Parthian riders were not retreating to rest. They were riding to the rear, where a long line of camels waited. There, fresh bundles of arrows were being distributed. The archers were reloading. A ripple of terror went through the Roman ranks as the realization hit them. There would be no lull. The enemy was not running out of ammunition. The Romans were not fighting a conventional battle. They were standing in front of an execution squad that had brought enough arrows to kill every single one of them. The desert floor was beginning to look like a field of porcupines, and the Roman army was dying without striking a single blow. Desperate to stop the hemorrhage, Crassus played his last card. He ordered his son, Publius Crassus, a decorated officer who had served with distinction under Caesar in Gaul, to lead a breakout force. Publius gathered 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and 8 cohorts of infantry, and charged the enemy lines. For a moment, it seemed to work. The Parthians broke contact and fled into the desert haze. Elated, Publius pushed his men forward, believing he had routed the enemy. He rode miles away from the safety of the main army, chasing shadows into the dust. But the retreat was a mirage. Once the Roman detachment was isolated, the Parthians stopped running and turned around. Out of the swirling dust emerged the cataphracts. These were not typical cavalry. They were moving statues of iron, horses and riders clad in mail so heavy that no Gallic spear could penetrate it. The light Gallic horsemen, accustomed to the slash and dash warfare of tribal Europe, were helpless. They fought with suicidal bravery, some even leaping from their saddles to grab the long Parthian lances with their bare hands or trying to stab the enemy horses in their unprotected bellies. But courage could not break iron. The cataphracts simply rode them down, crushing the lighter force under sheer weight and momentum. Pinned against a sand dune, wounded and surrounded, Publius realized the magnitude of the trap. Unwilling to be paraded as a prisoner in a foreign court, he ordered his shield-bearer to drive a sword through his side. The rest of his force was systematically dismantled. The Parthians did not just kill the son of Crassus. They turned him into a weapon of psychological warfare. When the main Roman army saw the Parthians returning through the heat waves, they did not bring relief. They brought a long spear, and mounted upon its tip was the severed head of Publius. Crassus, held high for his father to see. The last ember of hope in the Roman ranks was extinguished. The sight of Publius's head on a spear did more damage than 10,000 arrows. It shattered the last vestiges of Roman morale. The Parthian commander, Shurena, rode close enough to shout a taunt that cut through the silence. This man could not be Crassus's son, for no noble father would have so base a coward for a child. It was a lie. Publius had died bravely, but the psychological blow was struck. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the Parthians withdrew. It was their custom never to camp near the enemy or fight at night, fearing a chaotic infantry ambush in the dark. For the Romans, the setting sun brought a reprieve from the arrows, but it ushered in a different kind of horror. Inside the Roman camp, the legendary discipline of the legions evaporated. There were no fires lit, no meals cooked, and no sentries posted. The soldiers sat in the dark, listening to the groans of the wounded, knowing that tomorrow the arrows would return. In the center of the camp, the command tent was silent. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man whose ambition had dragged them there, had collapsed. He wrapped his cloak around his head and lay on the ground, refusing to speak or move, paralyzed by the grief of losing his son and the crushing weight of his failure. The general was gone. Only a broken old man remained. Realizing that their commander was catatonic, his lieutenants, Cassius Longinus and Octavius, took charge. They made the grim decision to retreat to the town of Carrhae under the cover of darkness. But speed required a terrible price. The 4,000 wounded soldiers, too injured to walk, had to be left behind. As the main column quietly slipped away into the night, The realization hit the men left on the sands. They began to scream, begging not to be abandoned to the enemy. Their cries echoed across the flat desert, alerting the Parthians to the retreat. But the Parthians, patient and cruel, did not pursue in the dark. They waited. When the sun rose, they rode into the abandoned Roman camp and methodically slaughtered all 4,000 helpless men, their throats cut where they lay. The long night was over, but the nightmare had only just begun. The retreat from Carrhae was not an organized withdrawal. It was a chaotic death march. The Roman army, now fragmented and terrified, scrambled towards the hill country near Senaca, hoping the rugged terrain would finally neutralize the Parthian cavalry. But Chronicles was not just a warrior. He was a master of psychological manipulation. He knew that digging the Romans out of the hills would be costly. Instead of attacking, he rode out to the Roman lines with his bow unstrung and his palm open. He offered a parley. He claimed the King of Kings desired peace and friendship with Rome, and that Crassus would be allowed to leave safely if they simply signed a treaty. Crassus, a man who had spent a lifetime in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, smelled the trap instantly. He knew there was no mercy in Chronicles' eyes. He refused, but his soldiers, broken by thirst and the trauma of the arrow storm, would hear none of it. They turned on their general. They banged their weapons against their shields, screaming that he was a coward to send men to die in battle while refusing to speak to the enemy when peace was offered. Facing a mutiny from his own legions, the richest man in Rome was forced down the hill, not as a commander, but as a hostage to his own army's fear. The meeting was a farce from the moment it began. The Parthians offered Crassus a horse with a golden bit, feigning honor. When Crassus mounted, the Parthian grooms began to whip the horse, trying to bolt him away from his staff. Realizing the kidnapping attempt, the Roman officers, led by Octavius, drew their swords. A confused, desperate scuffle erupted in the dust. There were no grand speeches, no duel of generals. Octavius was cut down. In the melee, a Parthian soldier named Pomaxathres thrust a spear into Crassus, or perhaps simply cut off his head in the confusion. The triumvirate was dead. The slaughter that followed was absolute. Without leadership, the remaining Roman army surrendered or scattered to be hunted down like game. Of the 40,000 men who had crossed the Euphrates, only 10,000 eventually made it back to Syria. 20,000 lay dead in the sand, carrion for the desert vultures. Another 10,000 were captured and marched hundreds of miles east to the border of modern-day Afghanistan, effectively vanishing from history. As for Crassus, the legend says the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat to mock his greed. Whether true or merely a poetic invention of history, the message was clear. The man who tried to buy glory found that the desert only accepted payment in blood. The death of Crassus was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a geopolitical earthquake that shook the foundations of the ancient world. For the first time in living memory, the invincible aura of the Roman legions was shattered. But the sting went deeper than the loss of 20,000 lives. The Parthians had captured the Aquilae, the golden eagles of the legions. To a Roman, the eagle was not simply a military standard. It was the physical embodiment of the legion's soul and the favor of Jupiter himself. 7 eagles were now in foreign hands, displayed as trophies in Parthian temples. This national humiliation would fester in the Roman psyche for 33 years, a constant, burning reminder that the East remained unconquered. Back in Rome, the political consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The First Triumvirate had been a delicate tripod of power. Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. Crassus had acted as the counterweight, the wealthy buffer between the two colossal military egos of his partners. With him buried in the desert, the structure collapsed. There was no longer a third man to mediate. Pompey and Caesar were left staring at each other across the void, and their unchecked rivalry would soon plunge the Republic into the civil war that would destroy it forever. Crassus had marched east to ensure he would be remembered as the first man in Rome. Instead, his death merely paved the bloody road for Caesar to take that title. It would not be until 20 BC that Rome would finally wash away the stain of Carrhae. The first emperor, Augustus, did not send armies to retrieve the lost eagles. He understood the lesson Crassus had failed to learn, that the desert does not forgive arrogance. Instead, Augustus used diplomacy, negotiating the return of the standards from the Parthian king Phraates IV. The eagles returned home to great fanfare, but the ghosts of Carrhae remained. The battle stood as a grim monument to the limits of Roman power, proving that while legions could conquer nations, they could not conquer geography itself. Rome's hunger for glory was endless, but the desert has no master. Subscribe to our channel to relive the heroic pages of history and follow the survivors who escaped the sands to fight another day.